I'm a neurodevelopmentalist, and that is a specialist that works with a particular group of people off a particular model of the brain. And there are two major components of our work. Is that the brain develops in a stepwise hierarchical fashion, every single brain, and then if your brain injured, it gets stopped at a certain point. If you have autism, it gets stopped at a certain point, or certain things are distorted. If you have learning disabilities, you're disorganized in another area. The other main concept of my work is neuroplasticity. And the fact is that the brain and the whole central nervous system is extremely plastic. And just to give you some little idea of how changeable and plastic the system is that the brain of a newborn baby has pretty much all the brain cells it's ever going to have. But the brain gets bigger, right? So the mass of the brain, 97% of the brain mass is the connections between the brain cells. And these are grown by stimulation from the environment. 3% of the brain is the actual mass of the brain cells. So you can see that these neural connections, which are produced by stimulation from the environment, way override the importance of the actual genetic makeup of the brain. Do you see? I don't care about what you inherited. What you do with the child, the stimulation opportunities provided to the child, and also if there's a problem, how do we normalize those pathways to the brain, is a lot more important than who your daddy was, all right? Lots of things can go right and lots of things can go wrong in developing brains. You can have an injury at birth where you don't get oxygen. The mother can have a certain infection in utero. The child can be injured in different ways, like vaccines, but we won't get into that. A lot of things can happen, an infection, encephalitis, or if a child has learning disabilities. It could just miss a developmental step. There could be something going on visually or auditorily. There's lots of things that can go right and can go wrong. My job as a neurodevelopmentalist, and what I do all the time and think about all the time and read about all the time, and I train to do under a private organization this work started back in the 40s, work based on the work of Temple Fay, Carl Delicato, Glenn Doman at the institutes in Philadelphia, looking at working with brain-injured children and helping them develop, and expanding that model and looking at how all children develop. The work of Carl Delicato, you may have heard of on autism. It's called The Ultimate Stranger. I don't know if you've read that book. It talks about, it was written in the 60s. It's a fascinating book, but he was the first one to actually get at the sensory basis for autism, that the way autistic kids act is based on sensory distortions and what you can do about those types of things. So anyway, I spend all my time designing, evaluating children, designing programs to find out what they can do right, what they can do wrong, what we can do to fix the things that are wrong, how do we accelerate the learning, and how do we help them reach their full God-given potential. So I design learning programs and stimulation programs to help normalize pathways to the brain and to help them function better. To give you an idea of the things we can do is we have fully brain-injured children that are never supposed to walk, talk, see, now walking, talking, and seeing. We have children that were autistic that are not autistic anymore. Getting rid of learning disabilities is a 1 to 2 year thing that's pretty easy. Improving CAPD, auditory processing disorders, name some labels. There's a whole alphabet soup of labels. The reason I'm doing these seminars is there's so much nonsense out there and parents are so afraid. If their child has a problem, it's scary because you get so much information about, you know, your child will always be this way, you have to learn to compensate this way, do that, institutionalize them, they'll never be able to live on their own. That's nonsense. There is lots and lots of hope. God has designed the brain to be plastic changeable, and we need to take that knowledge, discard the hopeless knowledge, take the knowledge of how to help our children progress. And that's why I'm doing this, not because I love to talk, but I get very, very frustrated reading the things out there all the time of all the labels and the hopelessness and the hopeless messages that parents are given. We have children with Down syndrome graduating from high school with their peers. We have children, you name it, any label, any developmental disorder we've worked with. We have, you know, it is truly a blessing to be able to provide parents with hope and information, but let him who boasts, boast in the Lord is not me. It's how the brain and the central nervous system is designed. So I'm kind of swimming upstream, but I do want to get the information out there, and I praise God that all these things have fallen into place. Aubrey has the equipment to tape these things. We can make the tapes available to parents, and more people can get the information, because I can't see every child. But more and more, the neurodevelopmental model will start to become the way of practice, like sensory integration disorder. Sensory integration disorder grew out of this work. The sensory integration work grew out of the neurodevelopmental work. Jean Ayres studied under the guys that developed the sensory stuff, especially Carl Delicato. Sunrise came out of, studied under Carl Delicato. All these different things actually came, anything that looks at stimulation programs came out of this work, because these guys were the pioneers. And I've been very privileged to meet and know quite a few of those. So anyway, eventually the tide will flow. The parents are driving therapy. The parents want hope for their kids, and they want answers. They don't want to be given hopelessness. They know this brain isn't fixing. They know their kid's smart. Why can't they do things? You know this. Your mommy heart tells you this. And you're right. So that's why I work with parents. Because you're right. You don't have to accept the things you've been given. Now, the information on auditory and visual processing applies to every single child and us. Okay, we can all improve our visual and auditory processing. If you have a child with certain problems, the basis of it may be auditory and visual processing problems. They can't take in information visually or auditory very well. Or you may have a specific diagnosis of central auditory processing disorder, which sounds very scary. But we've worked with it a long time before they even labeled it. All right. So I work with a broad range of problems. We can impact the central nervous system. The brain develops stepwise. All we have to do is find out where the problem is. And then our only question is, the concept of neuroplasticity is absolutely, there is no question it's real. There is no question that when you stimulate brains, you grow them. There's no question about that. All the research confirms it. You can type in neuroplasticity and get tons of articles of research going on. Clinically, therapeutically, it's not being done very much. Little bits are being done. But the reason I like this model is it's comprehensive, because I look at the visual, the auditory, and the tactile input in a developmental fashion. And then I look at fine motor, gross motor, and speech and language issues and processing issues in academics. So we can put all the pieces of the child in one place. What a concept. You don't have to take the kid to OT, PT, ST, VT, XYZ. You're running around going to all these different therapists, and nobody has the whole picture of your child except you, and you're trying to get these people to talk to each other, and it's very frustrating. And they're all working off different models. All right. Auditory and visual processing is extremely important for you to know with respect to where your child is functioning. I should have found Nathan's file. It's the single most important thing you can do to help your child function better. Okay, let's do some definitions. There are two main learning channels that we have. I'm not going to get into kinesthetic learners. You really don't learn much that way except how to get into trouble. You learn visually and auditorily, academically. There's the two main learning channels. Auditory and visual processing has to do with taking in information, how big a chunk of information you can take into short-term memory, hold there, and immediately put out. Okay, whether it's auditory and visual, and I'll show you how to test that in a minute. And then there's a component of, when you have it in short-term memory, what kind of rate processing you have, how fast you can process that information, and also the working memory. You know, how fast you can process it and how much you can hold in your working memory. To give you an example of how important this is, my colleague Linda Kane, I'm with ICANN, which is International Christian Association of Neurodevelopmentalists, and we formed a Christian organization in '99, mainly because there's lots of New Age stuff out there, and we just wanted to be an organization that confirms to parents that we hold their same worldview as they're Christians. There's lots of New Age stuff, especially in sound therapy, all kinds of nasty things. So, Linda Kane had a son with Down syndrome, her first son, and he did not, she tried everything she did stimulation programs, she did all this stuff with him, and he still functioned at a really, really low level. He had fluid in the ears. They didn't treat it because that's Down syndrome, right? You have Down syndrome, you have fluid in your ears. So they actually destroyed the bones in his ears before they treated the fluid. So he didn't have low auditory processing and couldn't hear because he had Down syndrome. He had this because they didn't treat him because he had the label of Down syndrome. That's a big difference. So, do we get happy at doctors? So anyway, the perception often causes problems with children. If your child has a label, they can treat the child as a label instead of a child. And it's very, very dangerous to a lot of kids. Matter of fact, 97% of the children that are labeled with Down syndrome before they're born are murdered. They're aborted. So most of them aren't even born. And they're getting better and better at finding out if that baby has Down syndrome. So that's where all the research is right now. Okay. Scott, Linda's son, was not on a neurodevelopmental program until he was 11 years old. And he couldn't hear, he didn't talk. Linda tried everything, really working with him. She was a stay-at-home mom, and then she had a special needs daycare, working with him and trying to find the best information. And he processed at a 2-year-old level when he started on the neurodevelopmental program, which means he could hold 2 pieces. Can you imagine having an 11-year-old, 2-year-old? 2 pieces in short-term memory. And he was considered extremely mentally retarded. He could only hold 2 pieces. He functioned like a 2-year-old, and that's all he could do. It didn't have anything to do with the potential of his system, but he couldn't do it. So Linda started working with him and worked on especially auditory processing, which he couldn't hear. He had major hearing loss. Did lots of sound therapy with him and all kinds of stuff to stimulate the auditory pathways to the brain. His processing went from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. It took 5 years. And finally got to 6. At 6, he could function with his peers. At 6, he could go out in the community to work. At 6, he could read and understand the conversations around him. Getting him up to a processing level of 6, and I'll show you what that means in a minute, meant the difference between a life of independence and working and the life of being in an institution. It's that significant. It can make the difference between being considered mentally retarded and functional.